The wind in the Dakota Territory of the late 1880s had a personality. It was not a gentle breeze that whispered through the pines of the Black Hills looming to the west. It was a bully. It scoured the plains, picking up the fine red dust and flinging it into the eyes of man and beast alike. It was the sound of an ending, a long, mournful cry for the open range that was slowly being choked by the straight, sharp lines of progress. Ash Ridge sat square in the middle of that progress, a raw collection of timber and hope plunked down between the glinting steel of the railroad tracks and the vast, rust-colored sea of grass where cattle grew fat for eastern markets. The town smelled of coal smoke, horse manure, and money waiting to be made. It was a place teetering on the edge of becoming a state, a fact that made men like Silas Van Dorn puff out their chests. The future, he believed, belonged to men who could tame the land, not to those who simply lived upon it. He stood on the boardwalk outside the bank, a thick man whose shadow seemed to stretch farther than a normal man's ought to. With him were Sheriff Blaine, a man whose silver star was less a badge of honor than a mark of ownership by Van Dorn, and Banker Hargreave, whose thin smile and darting eyes saw every transaction in town, legal or otherwise. They were the trinity that ran Ash Ridge, their power as unyielding as the barbed wire fences Van Dorn was stringing across miles of prairie. Fences that cared little for ancient buffalo trails or the needs of small ranchers. Their talk was low and confident, punctuated by the rhythmic chuffing of a locomotive preparing to depart. Another branch line was coming, they said, another artery to pump the wealth of the land back east. Across the dusty main street, in the chaotic bustle of the weekly market, a different kind of wealth was being traded. Here, farmers' wives sold eggs and butter, trappers offered up cured pelts, and a young Lakota woman named Wiyang Ska, known to the townsfolk as Elise Whitebird, sat quietly behind a small table. Her goods were a map of the land itself. There were bundles of sage and sweetgrass, small leather pouches filled with herbal remedies for coughs and fevers, and the soft, expertly tanned hides of rabbit and fox. At 22 years, she lived in the space between two worlds. She had the high cheekbones and steady, dark eyes of her people, but her calico dress was mended in the fashion of the town. She could speak English well enough, thanks to the patient nuns at a distant mission school, and read it slowly, her finger tracing the words as if they were animal tracks. Her stillness was a magnet in the swirl of the market. People trusted her. They knew her remedies worked and her prices were fair. Mrs. Gable, the blacksmith's wife, stopped to buy a poultice for her husband's burned hand, and Elise explained in a low, calm voice how to apply it. She moved with a quiet efficiency that wasted no motion. Tucked into the leather medicine bag at her hip, almost hidden from view, was a single, perfect eagle feather, its white and black edges sharp against the worn brown hide. It was a piece of the sky, a reminder of a world larger than the dusty streets of Ash Ridge. A sudden wail cut through the noise of the market. A small boy, no older than 5, with hair the color of corn silk, stood crying, his face streaked with dirt and tears. He had let go of his mother's hand for only a moment and was now hopelessly lost in a forest of adult legs. People glanced at him and then looked away, too busy with their own affairs. Elise rose from her stool. She did not rush. She approached the boy slowly, kneeling so her face was level with his. She said nothing at first, simply offering him a small, polished stone from her pocket. The boy's sobs hitched. He looked at the smooth, cool stone in her palm, then up at her kind face. She spoke softly, not in English, but in the flowing, musical tones of Lakota. The words did not matter. The sound was a gentle current that washed over his fear. He took the stone. A few moments later, his mother, a frantic woman in a faded sunbonnet, pushed through the crowd. Her face a mask of panic. She saw her son, safe and quiet beside the Lakota woman, and relief washed over her. "Thank you," she stammered. "Thank you." Elise simply nodded, gave the boy a small smile, and returned to her table as if nothing had happened. Later that afternoon, As the sun began its slow descent, Jack Hollis rode into town. He was a man of about 30, lean and long in the saddle, with eyes that had seen too much and a mouth that was quick to curve into a dry, tired smile. He moved like a man who was just passing through, which he always was. He had a peculiar habit of finding things that were broken and fixing them before moving on. A loose hinge on a general store door, a wobbly wheel on a farmer's cart, a stray calf separated from its mother. He was a drifter, a former cavalryman who still sometimes woke in a cold sweat with the dust and screams of the little bighorn in his throat. He did not talk about it. He preferred to let his hands do the talking. He left his horse at the livery and walked into the saloon, not for a fight, but for a quiet meal. The place was noisy, full of cowhands and railroad workers. Jack found a small table in the corner and ordered a plate of stew from the young Chinese cook, a boy named Wei who worked tirelessly in the back. As Wei brought the food, a burly freighter, smelling of cheap whiskey and self-importance, stuck out a leg and tripped him. The stew went flying, splashing across the floor. Laughter erupted. The freighter sneered at the boy, who was scrambling to clean up the mess, his face burning with shame. Jack Hollis sighed. He had not been looking for this. He never was. He got to his feet and walked over to the freighter. "Excuse me," he said, his voice quiet but carrying a weight that made the man look up. "I believe you owe the boy an apology and the owner the price of a plate of stew." The freighter, twice Jack's size, stood up, eager for a confrontation. "What I owe is none of your business, drifter." Jack nodded, as if considering the point. "You might be right," he said, "but it feels like my business." The fight was short and ugly. It was not a dance of fists like some men favored. Jack moved with a brutal economy learned in close-quarters combat. He sidestepped a clumsy punch, used the man's momentum against him, and laid him out on the floorboards. A chair splintered in the process. The saloon went silent. Jack looked down at the unconscious man, then at the broken chair. He pulled a few coins from his pocket and placed them on the bar. "That should cover the stew and the chair," he told the stunned owner. He then walked over to the pieces of the broken chair, gathered them into a neat pile, and set them by the wall, out of the way. He gave a small nod to Wei, who was staring at him with wide, grateful eyes, and then walked out of the saloon as quietly as he had entered. He had fixed what was broken. It was time to move on. That night, in his small room at the boarding house, Jack took a worn piece of paper from his saddlebag. It was an old railroad survey map, its creases softened with years of handling. It showed lines that were and lines that might have been. He traced one of the faded, proposed routes with his finger, a line that snaked deep into the heart of the prairie, near the Black Hills. He was not sure what he was looking for. A different map for his life. Perhaps a route away from the ghosts that rode with him. He folded it carefully and put it away. Outside, the Dakota wind howled, rattling the window frame, telling its own story of a wild land being carved into squares, a story of endings and beginnings, of a Lakota woman with an eagle feather and a drifter with a worn-out map, both searching for a place to call home. A few days after the saloon incident, a sense of routine had settled over Ash Ridge, the kind that comes just before a storm. Jack Hollis had found a short-term job riding the northern fence line for a small rancher, earning enough to keep him in food and lodging. It was quiet work, which suited him. It gave him time to think, though he tried not to do too much of that. At the town post office, a small, stuffy room that smelled of ink and sealing wax, Elise Whitebird was collecting a small parcel. It was not often she received mail. The package was wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine, addressed to her in the careful, looping script of Sister Agnes from the mission school. Inside was a heavy envelope and a short, hastily written letter. "My dear Elise," the letter read, "I found this among some of Patrick O'Hara's old effects that were donated to us years ago. I do not know its meaning, but I felt you should have it. Be careful." Elise unfolded the document from the envelope. It was a copy of a promissory note, written on thick, yellowed paper in a bold, masculine hand. The ink had faded to a rusty brown. It was dated over a decade prior. The language was strange, a mix of legal terms and personal sentiment. It spoke of a parcel of land, described not by neat surveyor's squares, but by landmarks, from the bent cottonwood on the Red Creek, west to the three standing stones, north to the place where the water goes underground, at the bottom. It designated the beneficiary in a way that made Elise's breath catch. I leave this in trust with the Mr. Hargreave of the Ash Ridge Bank, to be delivered to Whitebird's eldest daughter, when she is of an age to understand its worth. Whitebird was her aunt, her mother's sister, who had passed into the spirit world many years ago. She had been married to Patrick O'Hara, a jovial Irish trader. According to the customs of the Lakota people, a marriage the white man's law did not recognize, and Elise was not her daughter. Yet, the name felt like a stone dropping into a deep pool, its ripples spreading outwards. She tucked the paper into her medicine bag, the eagle feather resting against it, and a profound unease settled over her. At that very moment, Jack Hollis was standing inside the Ash Ridge Bank, waiting for banker Hargreave to cash the small check from his employer. The bank was quiet, a place of hushed tones and the soft rustle of paper money. The door to Hargreave's private office was slightly ajar. From within, Jack could hear the low, rumbling voice of Silas Van Dorn. The words were not meant for him, but the polished wood floor carried the sound. "This O'Hara business is a ghost," Silas was saying, his voice tight with impatience. "A piece of paper with no legal standing. The woman it mentions is long gone." "But the note?" "Mr. Van Dorn," Hargreave's reedy voice replied, laced with anxiety. "It exists. It is in my trust. Trusts are for living people. Hargreave, not for whispers. The river pasture is vital for the new rail spur. You will declare the document null and void. A legal fiction. Understand?" Jack heard the scrape of a chair, the finality in Van Dorn's tone. He did not understand the details, but he understood power. He had seen it on the faces of army colonels and heard it in the click of a rifle hammer being cocked. Hargreave finally emerged from the office, his face pale and slick with a thin sheen of sweat. He cashed Jack's check without meeting his eye, his hands trembling slightly as he counted out the coins. Jack took his money, gave a quiet nod, and left, the banker's fear clinging to the air like stale cigar smoke. That evening, a sliver of moon hung in the sky, and the ever-present wind carried a new scent through town. Smoke, but it was not the familiar smell of hearth fires. It was the sharp, acrid smell of burning paper and leather. A small crowd had gathered a safe distance from the bank, watching as a thin curl of smoke escaped from a back window. Sheriff Blaine was there, looking bored and unconcerned. "Just a lamp that got knocked over," he told the onlookers. "Nothing to see. Go on home." But Sister Agnes, who had ridden into town on the afternoon stage with supplies for the mission, saw something else. She saw the deliberate way the fire was contained, the lack of real alarm from the sheriff. Her heart grew cold with dread. She knew Patrick O'Hara had been an honest man, and she knew Silas Van Dorn was not. Holding her shawl tight against the wind, she hurried through the darkening streets to the small, clean cabin where Elise lived on the edge of town. "Elise," the nun said, her voice breathless as she burst through the door. "There was a fire. At the bank. In Hargreave's office. I fear they are trying to erase something." Elise looked at the nun's frightened face, then down at the old paper she had spread on her simple wooden table. She had been studying it for hours. Her knowledge of the land, her only map. The bent cottonwood, the three standing stones, the place where the water goes underground. She knew these places. They were not small landmarks defining a modest plot. They were vast markers, encompassing nearly half the county. They described the rich river pasture, the high grazing lands, the springs that never ran dry. It was the lifeblood of the entire region, an inheritance so immense it was impossible to believe, and if it was hers, as Whitebird's eldest daughter in spirit, if not in fact, then she was standing directly in the path of a man who took whatever he wanted. As if summoned by the thought, a flicker of movement outside her window caught her eye, a shadow detaching itself from other shadows, the shape of a man in a wide-brimmed hat, watching her cabin. He was there for only a second before melting back into the darkness, but it was enough. They knew she had the paper. They were watching her. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at her, but beneath it, something else stirred, a slow, steady anger. This land had nourished her people for generations. Patrick O'Hara, in his own way, had understood that. He had not seen it as property to be conquered, but as a living thing to be respected, and he had tried to pass that understanding on. She looked at Sister Agnes. "I have to see for myself," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I have to find the stone markers. The paper can be burned, but the land remembers." "It is too dangerous. Elise, the night is no place for a woman alone." Elise smiled, a faint, sad smile. "The night has been my friend for a long time, sister, and I will not be alone. I will have the stars to guide me." She saddled her pinto, a sturdy horse that moved with a silent, sure-footed grace. As she mounted, she felt the reassuring weight of the medicine bag at her hip, the eagle feather and the old document lying together. She cast one last look at her small cabin, a tiny point of light against an immense, dark prairie, and then urged her horse into a trot, heading west, away from the town and into the vast, whispering grasslands. From the edge of town, where the shadows were deepest, another rider watched her go. Jack Hollis had been preparing for his night watch, checking the cinch on his saddle, when he saw the lone figure ride out. He had seen her in the market, had noted her quiet strength. He did not know where she was going, or why she would ride into the dangerous, open country after dark. But he recognized the set of her shoulders, the determination in the way she sat her horse. It was the look of someone with a purpose that outweighed their fear. His own life was a string of purposes, most of them small and temporary. Fix a fence, find a stray, but the core of his being, the part of him that had survived the army and the long, drifting years since, was a simple, unbreakable rule. You do not let people face the darkness alone if you can help it. Without a second thought, he swung into his saddle and followed, keeping a careful, respectful distance. He would not intrude on her journey, but he would be there, a silent guardian, moving through the same night, under the same silent, watchful stars. The prairie at night was a different world, under the vast, star-dusted bowl of the sky. The land breathed, the constant wind, which scoured the earth by day, now whispered secrets through the tall grass. Elise Whitebird rode with the rhythm of this world, her pinto moving like a shadow across the moon-washed landscape. She had found it, an hour's ride from town. Nestled in a cluster of granite boulders was a flat-faced stone with the letters OH carved deep into its surface. Weathered by years of sun and snow, but unmistakable. Patrick O'Hara. The land remembered. The discovery had settled a cold stone of certainty in her stomach. The paper in her medicine bag was not a ghost or a dream. It was a map, and she was standing on the first landmark. But the certainty brought no joy, only a heavy sense of a looming fight. She turned her horse back towards the faint, distant glow of Ash Ridge, a place that was both her home and the source of her danger. She did not hear the other horse at first, its hoofbeats muffled by the thick turf. It was a subtle shift in the night's cadence, a feeling more than a sound, that made her pull up and listen, her hand resting lightly on her saddle. A rider emerged from a shallow coulee, not charging, but moving at a steady, unhurried pace. As he drew nearer, the moonlight caught the angles of his face. It was the man from the saloon, the drifter, Jack Hollis. He did not crowd her, but reined in his horse a few yards away. a gesture of respect. He brought his mount alongside hers, and, for a long moment, they rode in silence, two small figures in an immense, dark landscape. The only sounds were the creak of saddle leather and the sigh of the wind. He seemed to be searching for words, a task that clearly did not come easily to him. Finally, he pushed his hat back on his head and scratched his temple with a calloused finger, an awkward, almost boyish gesture. "Can I walk you home, miss?" The question was so unexpected, so formal and out of place in the wild darkness, that a small smile touched Elise's lips. She looked at him, really looked at him, seeing the tired lines around his eyes and the quiet competence in the way he held his reins. "I can get home on my own," she replied, her voice even. "But if you want to taste the dust from my horse's hooves, feel free to follow." A faint grin answered hers. "Fair enough," he said. "But it is a long ride to just be enjoying the night air. And it is a long way from the saloon to be playing guardian," she countered. "I saw what you did for the cook's boy." Jack's smile faded, replaced by a flicker of that shame she had heard about. "Just settling a bill," he mumbled, looking out at the horizon. The conversation fell into another comfortable silence before he spoke again. "It is my turn to ask, what business does a woman like you have with these rocks and this darkness?" Elise considered her answer. She would not trust him with the whole truth, not yet, but there was something about his presence, a solidness, a lack of pretense, that made her want to give him a piece of it. "An old paper," she said vaguely. "A family matter I needed to check on." He nodded slowly, accepting the non-answer. He did not press for more. Old papers can be complicated things. He seemed to be looking inward, at a landscape only he could see. "And you?" she asked, turning the question back on him. "Where are you from? What brings you to Ash Ridge?" He shrugged, a gesture that moved his whole upper body. "Here and there. I used to ride with the cavalry." He said the word as if it were a piece of grit he was spitting out. "Now, I am just looking for what? A different map, I suppose. The ones they give you in the army. They only show you how to get to the fight. I am trying to find one that shows you the way out." Elise understood that feeling completely. She too was navigating by a new map, one that led not to a war, but perhaps to a different kind of battleground. They rode on, the strange, unspoken kinship of two drifters settling between them, as the scattered lights of Ash Ridge grew brighter, marking the edge of town. Jack subtly reined his horse back, increasing the distance between them. It was another small, deliberate gesture of respect, a recognition that her reputation in a town like this was a fragile thing. "If anyone gives you any trouble," he said, his voice low and serious, "I will talk to them. I will even be polite about it, at first." Before Elise could reply, three figures stepped out of the shadows of the livery stable. Sheriff Blaine and two of his deputies blocked their path, their faces smug in the lantern light. "Well, well," Blaine said, his voice thick with lazy authority. "What have we here out for a midnight ride?" Whitebird. His use of her Lakota name was not a sign of respect, but a way of marking her as an outsider. "We are just coming back into town. Sheriff," Elise said, her voice calm and devoid of fear. The sheriff's eyes shifted to Jack. "And you, drifter, I thought you would have been long gone by now." "I do not like your kind around here. You cause trouble." "I fix things that are broken," Jack replied, his tone flat. "Sometimes that looks like trouble to the people who broke them." Blaine took a step forward, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. He meant to intimidate, to posture in front of his men, but Jack was not looking at the sheriff's face. His gaze was fixed on the man's hip. "Sheriff, you might want to mind that firearm," Jack said, his voice conversational. "The safety strap is undone. A man could trip in the dark, and that hammer looks like it would fall easy. It would make for a messy accident, not to mention the paperwork." The two deputies glanced down at their boss's holstered gun. Blaine's face flushed a deep, mottled red. He looked down and saw that Jack was right. The leather thong that secured the hammer was loose, dangling uselessly. He fumbled with it, his clumsy fingers making the simple task seem difficult. The air of menace was gone, replaced by a sudden, sharp embarrassment. He had been made to look like a fool in front of his own men, not by a threat, but by a quiet observation. "Get on home, both of you," Blaine snarled, trying to recover his authority, "and stay out of trouble." They rode past, leaving the sheriff and his men standing in the street. At the turnoff to her cabin, Elise stopped. She looked at Jack, seeing him more clearly now. He had not drawn a weapon. He had not raised his voice. He had used his eyes and his wits, disarming a dangerous man more effectively than any bullet could have. He had put her safety first, and he had known precisely when to stop talking. "Thank you," she said, and the words carried more weight than just two simple syllables. He just touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement. "Good night, Miss—" He watched until she had reached her cabin and a light appeared in the window. Then he turned his horse and headed for the boarding house. Inside, Sister Agnes was waiting by the cold hearth, her rosary beads clicking softly in her hands. She looked up, her face etched with worry. As Elise entered, "You found it," the nun whispered. Elise nodded, unpinning her hat. "It is there. O'Hara's mark is on the stone, just as the paper describes. It is real, sister. All of it." Relief and fear warred in the older woman's eyes. "Then you must be more careful than ever. Child, Silas Van Dorn will not be stopped by a piece of stone or an old piece of paper. He will try to take it, and he will crush anyone who stands in his way." Elise looked out her window into the dark night. "Let him try," she said softly. Across town, in his small, plain room, Jack Hollis sat on the edge of his bed. The encounter with Blaine had left a sour taste in his mouth. He was tired of bullies in uniform. He pulled the worn railroad map from his saddlebag and unfolded it under the light of his lantern. He thought about the direction Elise had come from, west of town, towards the Red Creek. She had mentioned something about the place where the water goes underground. He found the creek on the map, a thin blue line snaking down from the hills, and then he saw it. A faint, dotted line, marked proposed spur line B, branched off from the main tracks just outside of Ash Ridge. It followed the creek bed, cutting straight through the heart of the river pasture, the very land described in O'Hara's note. It was not just about grass for cattle. It was about water rights, and it was about the railroad. Whoever controlled that pasture and that water source would control where the new station was built. They would control the flow of every head of cattle, every bushel of grain, every dollar that came in or out of the territory on that line. Silas Van Dorn was not just trying to steal a pasture. He was trying to steal the future of the entire region. Jack folded the map. The complex, greedy lines of it now burned into his mind. The different map he had been looking for had found him after all, and it was leading him straight into a fight. The days that followed fell into a new pattern. A quiet conspiracy between two people against a landscape that was being forced to lie. Elise Whitebird led, and Jack Hollis followed, though it quickly became more of a partnership. She navigated by the curve of a hill, the memory of a winter creek bed, the way the grass leaned after a storm. He moved with a surveyor's eye, noting the angles of the sun, the subtle dips in the terrain that suggested water, the clusters of rock that would make a solid foundation for a fence or a landmark. Their conversations were sparse, born of the vast silences of the prairie. They were a study in contrasts. He would ask a practical question, and she would answer with a story. "This ridge," Jack said one afternoon, squinting at the horizon. "Does it have a name?" "My grandfather called it the place where the sky rests its chin," she replied without looking at him. Jack chewed on that for a moment. "That is a fine name. Hard to put on a map, though." She gave him a sideways glance, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. "Some things are not meant to be held by a map. Some things are meant to be held in your heart. Their search for O'Hara's markers was slow and meticulous. They found the second one, a tall stone shaped like a hawk's beak, and the third, a trio of petrified logs half buried in a dry wash. With each discovery, the immensity of the claim became more real, a silent, sprawling truth written on the face of the land itself. And with each passing day, they learned the grammar of each other's movements, the meaning of a held breath or a sudden stillness. It was during their survey of the Red Creek that they found the dam. It was not a grand structure, just a cleverly built wall of rock and packed earth, hidden in a narrow bend. It was new, the mud still dark and damp, the surrounding willows freshly cut. It diverted a significant portion of the creek's flow into a deep, man-made channel that snaked away towards the vast, fenced-in pastures of Silas Van Dorn's ranch. It was theft, plain and simple, not of a cow or a horse, but of the water that gave the entire region life. "Here is your proof," Jack said, his voice a low growl. "This is more than just an old paper. This is a crime." Elise knelt by the water's edge, touching the muddy bank. "The land does not lie," she said softly. "Only men do." Their trust was not forged in words, but in the small, unthinking moments of survival. One afternoon, while Jack was sighting a distant butte, his mind on lines and angles, he took a step backward without looking. A low hiss, almost silent, stopped him cold. He froze, his eyes finding Elise's. She did not speak. She simply nodded her head downwards, not 3 feet from his boot. Coiled in the sparse shade of a sagebrush was a rattlesnake, its tail a blur of silent warning. Elise made a low, guttural sound in her throat, a sound of the earth. And the snake, after a tense moment, uncoiled and slithered away into the rocks. Jack let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding. He owed her his life. 2 days later, he repaid the debt. Elise was tracking a set of prints, her attention focused on the ground, when Jack's hand shot out and grabbed her arm, pulling her back so hard she stumbled against him. "What is it?" she asked, startled. He did not answer, only pointed. Almost invisible against the dusty ground was a loop of rusted cable, attached to a heavy spring trap hidden beneath a covering of leaves and dirt. It was a vicious thing, meant to snap a coyote's leg. It would have done the same to hers. She looked from the cruel metal jaws of the trap to his face, and saw, not pride, but a deep, somber concern. They stood there for a moment, the heat of his hand still on her arm, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. They were in this together, miles away, in the cool, dark luxury of his ranch house office. Silas Van Dorn swirled a measure of whiskey in a heavy glass tumbler. Banker Hargreaves sat opposite him, his hat in his lap, his face pale and sweating despite the room's chill. He pushed a sheaf of documents across the polished mahogany desk. "It is done," Hargreaves said, his voice barely a whisper. "The probate court has accepted the filing. The O'Hara lands are officially declared unclaimed and without legal heir. They will revert to the territory for auction, an auction which, of course, you will win." Van Dorn picked up the papers, but did not look at them. He looked at the banker. "Good," he said, his voice flat. "You see, Hargreave, the law is just a tool, like a shovel or a branding iron. You just have to have the strength to wield it." He took a slow sip of his whiskey, a cold, triumphant smile spreading across his face. That evening, as Elise and Jack rode back towards town, a lone rider approached from the south. It was Standing Bear, her mother's cousin, a respected elder among the Lakota. He was a man of immense dignity, his face a roadmap of seasons and sorrows. He reined in his horse, his eyes grave. He spoke in Lakota, his words for Elise alone. "The drums have been talking. Little niece, they speak of a fire that wants to burn what is yours. The wind carries a bad name on it tonight. Do not sleep in your own bed. It is not a safe place for you." He did not wait for a reply. He gave a solemn nod to her, a curious, measuring look to Jack, and then turned his horse and rode back the way he had come, a sentinel disappearing into the twilight. A chill that had nothing to do with the evening air settled over Elise. They saw the glow from a mile away, a malevolent orange pulse against the deepening purple of the sky. Elise knew, with a sickening certainty, what it was. She spurred her horse, Jack keeping pace beside her, their silent ride now a frantic race against a fire that had already won. Her small cabin, which she used as a workshop and a place to store her herbs and remedies, was engulfed in flames. The fire roared, consuming the dried sage and sweetgrass, the tanned hides, the years of her work. It was not just a building burning. It was her life, her connection to her craft, her place in the community. She slid from her horse and stood there, helpless, the intense heat on her face, the acrid smoke filling her lungs. The townspeople were gathered at a distance, their faces flickering in the firelight, some with pity, others with a cold, fearful curiosity. Sheriff Blaine was there, of course, making a great show of organizing a bucket brigade that was doing nothing. The roof collapsed with a great shower of sparks, and something inside Elise broke with it. She stood alone, a solitary figure silhouetted against the destruction, her world reduced to ash and smoke. Jack came to stand beside her. He did not speak. There were no words for this. He simply took off his heavy canvas jacket and draped it over her shoulders. It was a small, simple act, but in it, she felt a profound comfort. It was the weight of his presence, a silent promise that she was not as alone as she felt. The fire divided Ash Ridge as surely as a barbed wire fence. The next morning, as Elise stood in the cold, gray dawn, surveying the smoldering ruins, Mrs. Gable, the blacksmith's wife, came with a warm blanket and a jar of broth. "Some debts are not paid with money," she said, her voice full of a quiet, fierce loyalty. But others in town, merchants who had bought her remedies for years, now found their boots endlessly interesting when she passed. They were afraid. Silas Van Dorn's power was a long shadow, and no one wanted to be caught standing in it. The unspoken prejudice of the town, usually hidden behind polite smiles, was now out in the open. She was the Indian woman who was reaching above her station, and this fire was the town's ugly way of putting her back in her place. Jack helped her sift through the wreckage, his hands gentle as they searched for anything salvageable. There was almost nothing left, but as she knelt in the ashes, her fingers closed around something hard and smooth. It was the eagle feather. It was singed at the edges, blackened with soot, but it had not burned. She held it in her palm, its resilience a silent message. She stood up, her face streaked with ash, her eyes burning with a fire that no one could extinguish. She looked at Jack, at the concerned faces of the few friends who had dared to stand with her, and at the hostile, shuttered windows of the town beyond. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it carried with the clear, cutting force of a winter wind. "Patrick O'Hara left this land to Whitebird's eldest daughter," she said. "My name is Wiangska, and I'm coming to claim it." The fire had burned away Elise's past, but it had hardened her future into a sharp point. In the days that followed, she and Jack moved with a quiet, shared purpose. While Jack found work patching the roof of the livery stable, a task that allowed him to watch the comings and goings of the town, Elise received another visit from Sister Agnes. The nun arrived not with condolences, but with a weapon. It was another piece of paper, this one a crisp, official-looking copy of a page from the mission's baptismal register. Her gloved finger pointed to an entry dated 23 years prior. The entry was for a Lakota infant, and next to the mother's name, Whitebird, was a note handwritten by the mission priest, now long dead. It read, "Marriage recognized under Lakota custom to Patrick O'Hara." "It is not a state license," Sister Agnes said, her voice low and urgent. "But it is a record, an acknowledgement by the church of their union." In the eyes of God, they were man and wife. A clever lawyer might argue that in the eyes of the law, that makes you, as her sister's child and effective heir, his next of kin. Elise stared at the paper. It was a fragile bridge between two worlds, a white man's document that acknowledged a Lakota truth. It was more than she had dared hope for. Meanwhile, Jack was building a different kind of bridge. He sought out the railroad's chief engineer, a harried man named Thompson, who was more concerned with grades and timetables than with local politics. Over a tin mug of bitter coffee at the town's small eatery, Jack steered the conversation with casual questions. "That new spur line," Jack said, tracing an imaginary line on the table with his finger. "Looks like a tough bit of country to lay track." Thompson grunted in agreement. "It is, but Mr. Van Dorn has made it clear that the route through the Red Creek pasture is the only one he will approve for access. Says it is the flattest grade. And the most direct route to that spring that never runs dry," Jack added, as if it were an afterthought. The engineer looked at him, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "You are a sharp man. Hollis. Yes, whoever controls that spring controls where the new cattle pens and the water tower go. And whoever controls the water tower controls the station. Silas Van Dorn is not buying a pasture. He is buying a railroad." The information settled like a lead weight in Jack's gut. This was bigger than a land grab. It was a play for absolute control over the entire territory's economy. He thought of Elise, standing in the ashes of her life's work, and a cold, protective anger took root in him. That same afternoon, Banker Hargreave was once again summoned to Silas Van Dorn's office. The cattle baron did not offer him a seat. He stood by the window, a massive silhouette against the bright afternoon sun. "The paperwork from the court is not enough," Van Dorn said, his voice a low rumble. "Rumors are starting. That Indian woman is talking to the nun. I want the original O'Hara note. I want your private ledger that records it. I want every scrap of paper that connects that man to that land destroyed, erased. Do you understand me?" Hargreave. "But my professional duty," the banker stammered. "My trust." "Your trust is with me now," Van Dorn cut him off, turning from the window. "Or it can be with the bottom of a ravine, in exchange for your full cooperation. I will see to it that you receive a handsome number of shares in the new Ash Ridge Railhead Corporation. You will be a rich man, a silent rich man. The choice is yours." Hargreave, trapped between his fear and his greed, could only nod, his face the color of old parchment. Armed with the baptismal record, Elise and Jack rode to the county seat, a larger, more self-important town a half-day's ride from Ash Ridge. The courthouse was an imposing brick building, a monument to the power of paperwork. Inside, they stood before the county clerk, a man with a thin mustache and an even thinner smile named Mr. Peterson. Elise laid her documents on the polished counter, O'Hara's promissory note, a hand-drawn map of the landmarks, and the copy of the baptismal record. "I am here to file a formal claim of inheritance on the lands of the late Patrick O'Hara," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Mr. Peterson peered at the papers through his spectacles, his expression one of bored disdain. He picked up the promissory note. "This is not a legal will, and it is made out to a white bird's eldest daughter. I see no one here by that name." "That was my aunt," Elise explained patiently. "I am her niece, Ska." The clerk's eyes narrowed at the Lakota name. He tapped a finger on the baptismal record. "And what is your Christian name?" "Woman. This claim cannot be filed without a proper legal signature, a Christian name signature." "My name is Elise," she said, "but the name of my people is Ska." He pushed the papers back across the counter. "I am sorry. The law is very particular about these things. Until you can provide a proper legal name and a more substantial proof of inheritance, I cannot accept this filing. Come back when you have your affairs in order." It was a dismissal, wrapped in the polite venom of bureaucracy. As they walked out of the courthouse, their request denied. The whispers of the people in the hall followed them like flies. Did you see that an Indian trying to claim half the county? What would they even do with all that land? Elise stopped on the courthouse steps, her back straight, her head held high. She did not turn to face the whispers, but she spoke, her voice carrying in the still air, loud enough for those inside to hear. The land holds us, not the other way round. On the ride back, a heavy silence hung between them. The law, which was supposed to be blind, had looked at the color of her skin and slammed the door. That night, Jack saw two of Van Dorn's men ride to the telegraph office. He watched them for a while, then went inside himself, claiming he needed to send a message to a cousin back east, while the operator tapped out his meaningless message. Jack's eyes roamed the office, noting the tangle of wires, the relay switches, the way the system worked. He had learned Morse code in the army, and he understood the logic of circuits and connections. Later, when the moon was high and the town was asleep, he slipped out of the boarding house and went to the back of the telegraph office. He did not break anything. He was a fixer, not a destroyer. He simply found the small relay box on the outside wall, opened it, and disconnected a single, crucial wire that routed messages through the local network. Van Dorn could still send a telegram to Chicago, but any messages he tried to send to his men in the next county, any urgent orders for hired muscle, would go nowhere. It was a small act of sabotage, a quiet defiance of the technology that his enemy was using as a weapon. The next day, the sky turned a sickly yellow. The wind, which had been a constant companion, fell eerily silent. A great dark wall was building on the western horizon. A dust storm. The ranchers and townsfolk hurried to secure their homes and livestock. The air grew thick and heavy, tasting of grit. Elise and Jack were riding the southern edge of the disputed pasture when it hit. The wall of dust and sand descended on them with a terrifying roar, blotting out the sun and turning the world into a howling, blinding chaos. They could not see more than a few feet in any direction. Through the maelstrom, they heard the panicked, high-pitched bawling of young calves, separated from their mothers. Instinct took over. They found each other in the gloom and, working together without a word, began to slowly herd the terrified animals towards a shallow, rocky overhang they had passed earlier. It was brutal, exhausting work. The dust clogged their throats and stung their eyes. The wind threatened to tear them from their saddles, but they moved as one, a small island of purpose in a sea of chaos. They managed to push a half-dozen of the small, trembling animals into the relative shelter of the rocks just as the full fury of the storm broke. For hours, they huddled there, sharing a canteen of water, their shoulders pressed together against the cold, their bodies a shield for the calves. In the howling darkness, stripped of everything but the will to survive, their bond was forged into something solid and unbreakable. When the storm finally passed, leaving behind a world blanketed in a fine layer of red dust, they were exhausted, but alive. They pushed the calves back out onto the plain, where the frantic calls of their mothers could now be heard. As the sun began to set, casting long, strange shadows across the transformed landscape, they rode back towards Ash Ridge. The town looked weary, beaten. As they dismounted at the livery, a man stepped out of the saloon across the street. He was tall and thin, dressed in dark, practical clothing, with a stillness about him that was more menacing than any boast. He wore two holstered pistols, low on his hips, their handles worn smooth with use. His face was gaunt, his eyes a pale, flat gray that seemed to see everything and reveal nothing. He moved with the lazy grace of a predator. His eyes swept the street and then settled on Jack. A flicker of something, not quite recognition, but the acknowledgement of a shared, bloody past passed between them. The man's lips twisted into a thin, humorless smile. Jack felt a cold dread wash over him, a feeling he had not experienced since the smoke and chaos of the Little Bighorn. He knew this man, Cole Maddox. He had been in Jack's platoon. a man who enjoyed the wet work of war a little too much, a man to whom Jack owed a debt that could only be paid in blood. Maddox gave a slow, deliberate nod, then turned and walked back into the saloon, leaving Jack standing in the dusty street with the ghosts of his past swirling around him like the last eddies of the storm. The sight of Cole Maddox froze the air in Jack Hollis's lungs. It was a face from a nightmare, a ghost in a worn duster, and it brought the whole bloody, screaming past rushing back in an instant. Jack gave Elise a look, a silent warning to stay back, and then walked with deliberate, measured steps toward the saloon. He could not run from this. This was a debt that had followed him across the plains, and its collector had finally arrived. He pushed through the saloon doors. Maddox was waiting at a corner table, a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses in front of him. He gestured to the empty chair. The other patrons, sensing the dangerous current in the air, gave the table a wide berth. "Been a long time, Hollis," Maddox said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "I heard a man matching your description had a disagreement with a freighter in here. Sounded like your kind of quiet work." Jack did not sit. "What do you want, Cole?" Maddox poured 2 glasses of whiskey, his movements slow and precise. "I want to talk about what I am owed. You remember that village by the Rosebud? The one the colonel called a nest of vipers? There were government bounties on offer, a bonus for every hostile removed. We could have been rich men that day. But you, Sergeant Hollis, you had a crisis of conscience. You refused a direct order. You stood in our way." "They were not hostiles," Jack said, his voice dangerously quiet. "They were old men and women and children. It was not a battle. It was a slaughter." Maddox laughed, a dry, mirthless sound. "It was a payday. And you cost me mine. That is a debt I have come to collect." He pushed one of the whiskey glasses toward the empty chair. A friendly drink, for old time's sake. Jack knew it was a trap. He also knew that refusing would be seen as a sign of fear. He walked to the table, but instead of sitting, he picked up the glass, his eyes never leaving Maddox's. He held it to the light, then slowly poured the contents onto the dusty floorboards. The whiskey soaked into the wood, leaving a dark, spreading stain. "I am not drinking with you, Cole," he said. "That war is over." "For you, maybe," Maddox hissed, his hand dropping below the table. "For me, the accounting is just beginning." Jack saw the movement and reacted instantly, kicking the table over, sending the bottle and glass crashing to the floor. The saloon erupted in chaos. A gunshot roared, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. A searing pain tore across Jack's left side, just below his ribs. He dove for cover behind the overturned table as a second shot splintered the wood where his head had been. He drew his own pistol, his movements fluid and practiced. He did not fire wildly. He waited. Maddox, thinking he had the advantage, stepped out from behind the bar. Jack fired once. Maddox cried out, a sharp, angry sound, and staggered back, his right arm hanging uselessly at his side, his pistol clattering to the floor. He clutched his wounded shoulder, his face a mask of fury and pain, before Jack or anyone else could move. Maddox kicked open the back door of the saloon and disappeared into the night alley. The next morning, Silas Van Dorn put the next phase of his plan into motion, while Jack was laid up in his boarding house room, Elise cleaning and bandaging his wound with a grim, focused silence. Sheriff Blaine and 3 deputies rode out to the small Lakota encampment where Standing Bear lived. They found him tanning a hide, his movements slow and methodical. They arrested him for cattle rustling. The charge was a lie, a flimsy pretext. They claimed a calf with Van Dorn's brand had been found near his lodge. It was a plant, a piece of manufactured evidence. But in the eyes of the law in Ash Ridge, it was enough. Their goal was not a conviction. Their goal was a hostage. When news of the arrest reached Elise, a cold, calculated fury settled over her. This was not an attack on her. It was an attack on her family, on the honor of her people. She went directly to the jail, a small, squalid brick building that smelled of despair. Sheriff Blaine was sitting behind his desk, his boots propped up, a smug look on his face. "I am here to see my uncle." "Standing Bear," Elise said, her voice cutting through the stuffy air. "He is under arrest for theft," Blaine said, not bothering to move. "No visitors." "On what grounds are you holding him without a hearing?" Elise asked. Sister Agnes had spent hours coaching her, drilling the strange, powerful words of the white man's law into her memory. "The law requires you to produce the body of the prisoner before a judge and provide a valid reason for his detention. It is called habeas corpus. If you fail to do so, you are breaking the law yourself." "Sheriff." Blaine swung his feet off the desk, his smug expression faltering. He was not used to being challenged, especially not by a Lakota woman quoting Latin legal terms. "Where did you hear that nonsense?" he blustered. "It is not nonsense," Elise replied calmly. "It is the foundation of your justice system. I expect you to follow it." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her words were like stones, solid and unmovable. She turned and walked out, leaving the sheriff sputtering in her wake. That night, a small group of conspirators gathered in the warm, fragrant kitchen of the town's main boarding house, run by the formidable widow, Mrs. Gable. She was a woman who had seen her share of injustice and had little patience for bullies. In attendance were Elise, Jack, his side tightly bandaged, Sister Agnes, and Wei, the young Chinese cook Jack had defended. Their plan was audacious, born of desperation and a shared sense of decency. "Wei, your steamed buns are the best in the territory," Sister Agnes began, her eyes twinkling with a most un-nun-like mischief. "But I was thinking they might be even better with a special ingredient. My private stock of communion wine is surprisingly potent, if one were to, say, soak the dough in it for several hours. What effect do you think that might have on two bored, thirsty deputies?" A slow smile spread across Wei's face. He understood immediately. The plan was a model of quiet efficiency. Mrs. Gable, on the pretense of taking pity on the deputies guarding the jail, delivered a large, covered basket late in the evening. Inside were a dozen of Wei's special, wine-soaked steamed buns, still warm from the oven. The deputies, grateful for the unexpected kindness, devoured them eagerly. An hour later, Jack and Elise slipped through the back alley to the jail. The two deputies were slumped in their chairs, snoring loudly, lost in a deep, alcoholic slumber. The key to the cells was on a hook on the wall. Jack retrieved it, his movements silent. Standing Bear was awake, sitting perfectly still on his cot in the darkness. He showed no surprise, only a deep, knowing calm. He followed them out into the cool night air without a word. In the alley, he stopped and turned to Elise. He removed a necklace of polished bone and blue beads from around his neck and placed it in her hands. "You carry a heavy burden for our people, little niece," he whispered in Lakota. "This will remind you that you do not carry it alone. When you stand, the entire tribe stands with you." He touched her cheek gently, then melted into the darkness, heading for the safety of the open plains. Later, in the quiet of Mrs. Gable's kitchen, Elise tended to Jack's wound again, replacing the bandage with fresh linen. The bullet had only grazed him, but it had left a nasty, raw furrow along his side. "You should have been more careful," she said, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. He did not look at her. He looked at her hands, at the gentle, efficient way they worked. "I know," he said. He finally met her eyes, and for the first time he spoke her Lakota name, his pronunciation careful, the syllables catching slightly in his throat. "Wiyang Ska." A genuine, beautiful smile lit up her face, transforming her weary features. She laughed, a low, musical sound. "You say it like the wind trying to learn its way through a horse's mane." The tension and fear of the past few days seemed to melt away in that small moment of shared warmth. A new understanding, deeper than their shared danger, passed between them. It was a fragile beginning, a single point of light in a vast darkness. Jack reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out the folded, worn railroad map. It was his only real possession, the chart of his own lost wanderings. He held it out to her. "You are the one with the real map now," he said. "But this one shows the enemy's plans. It belongs with you." Elise accepted the map, her fingers brushing his. She then reached for the medicine bag at her hip and took out the singed eagle feather. She held it out to him. "And you should carry this," she said. "It will help you find your way." He took the feather, its lightness a strange and powerful weight in his hand, the map for the feather, a drifter's past for a warrior's future. It was a silent pact, a promise to walk the same road together. Just before dawn, Jack, unable to sleep, slipped out and made his way back to the telegraph office. He reconnected the wire he had disabled. An army that is deaf is one thing, he thought, but an army that thinks it is hearing everything is even better. He rigged a second, almost invisible wire to the main line, running it to a small, discarded sounder he had found in a junk pile. It was a risk, but he needed to know what Van Dorn was planning. He did not have to wait long. As the first light of dawn touched the sky, the sounder began to click. It was a coded message, but the military had taught him their codes well. He scribbled furiously on a scrap of paper, translating the frantic dots and dashes. "Inspection team arrives tomorrow noon. Railroad and county surveyors will mark official boundaries on O'Hara land. Ensure a significant accident occurs. No witnesses." Jack stared at the words, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. The fight was no longer in the shadows. It was coming into the open. Silas Van Dorn was done with threats and legal tricks. He was planning to settle this claim tomorrow, under the bright Dakota sun, with blood. The sun was a hammer. It beat down on the parched prairie, turning the air into a shimmering haze and baking the red earth until it was hard as brick. By noon, the heat was a physical presence, a relentless weight on the shoulders of the small procession making its way across the open land. The party consisted of 2 county surveyors, their faces already burned red. Their lead, a fussy, sweat-stained man named Abernathy, Elise Whitebird, and Jack Hollis. A short distance behind them, Sheriff Blaine and 2 deputies followed, their presence a sullen, official threat. Elise rode at the head of the group, guiding them not by a map, but by memory and instinct. She was an island of calm in the oppressive heat, her movements fluid and economical, her eyes scanning the familiar landscape. Jack rode slightly behind her and to one side, his own eyes in constant motion, but he was not looking at the landmarks. He was scanning the ridges, the rocky outcrops, the heat-shimmering horizon. He knew they were not alone. The first shot came without warning. It was not aimed to kill. It was a sharp crack that echoed across the plain, followed by the angry buzz of a bullet kicking up a puff of dust 20 feet in front of Elise's horse. The surveyor's horses shied and missed her. Abernathy let out a startled cry. Sheriff Blaine and his men made a great show of drawing their weapons, but they did not move forward. Jack did not draw his gun. He did not shout. He simply turned his horse and spurred it into a gallop, not towards the sound of the shot, but in a wide, circling arc towards the low, rocky ridge from where it had come. Elise watched him go, a knot of fear tightening in her chest, but she did not stop. She had to keep the surveyors moving forward. Jack used the contours of the land for cover, his horse's hooves eating up the ground. He came up the back of the ridge, dismounted, and moved the last 50 yards on foot, as silent as a predator. He found Cole Maddox lying prone behind a cluster of boulders, his rifle resting on a rock, his gaze fixed on the party below. "You still pull your shots to the left when you are scared." "Cole," Jack said, his voice calm and conversational. Maddox stiffened. his body going rigid with surprise. He started to roll over, to bring the rifle to bear, but Jack was already there, the muzzle of his own pistol pressed firmly against Maddox's temple. "Do not," Jack said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "Just do not." "Hollis!" Maddox rasped, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fury. "I should have known Van Dorn was not paying me enough to have to deal with you." "Get on your horse and ride out," Jack said. "This is not our war anymore. Tell Silas Van Dorn his accident has been cancelled." Maddox slowly, carefully, got to his feet. He stared at Jack, his pale eyes full of a venomous hatred. "This is not over," he said. "There is no statute of limitations on a debt like yours." He backed away, retrieved his horse, and rode away without looking back. Down on the plain, Elise had reached the hawk-beaked stone. Mr. Abernathy, though shaken, was a professional. He set up his tripod and began to take his readings, his assistant dutifully recording the measurements in a leather-bound logbook. It was then that two of Van Dorn's ranch hands, who had been lingering nearby, rode up. One of them dismounted, a heavy sledgehammer in his hand. "Sorry, folks," he said with a lazy grin. "Boss says this old rock is a hazard to his cattle." He swung the hammer with all his might. The ancient stone, which had stood for generations, shattered into a dozen pieces, the OH carving of Patrick O'Hara obliterated into dust and fragments. It was a brazen act of destruction, done in plain sight of the law. "Mr. Abernathy looked aghast. "Without the marker," he stammered, "my survey is invalid. I cannot confirm the boundary." Sheriff Blaine trotted forward, a smug look of triumph on his face. "Looks like this whole thing was a wild goose chase," he declared. "This woman has been wasting the county's time. I am placing her under arrest for public mischief and impeding an official survey." He reached for Elise's arm, but before he could touch her, a figure stepped forward. It was Sister Agnes, who had followed the party at a distance in a small, dusty buckboard. She was holding a large, rolled piece of parchment. "You will do no such thing, Sheriff," she said, her voice ringing with an authority that had nothing to do with the law and everything to do with righteousness. She unrolled the parchment. It was a detailed architectural drawing, done in the precise hand of the mission's master stonemason, dated 15 years prior. It showed the designs for a new church bell tower, and for reference, it included a detailed sketch of the surrounding landscape, including the hawk-beaked stone, with a note O'Hara's marker. "The mission archives," Sister Agnes announced coolly, "are quite extensive. This drawing, a historical document, corroborates the existence and location of the marker. I believe that is what you call evidence. Mr. Abernathy." Abernathy peered at the drawing, his professional curiosity overriding his fear. "Yes," he said slowly. "Yes, this is remarkable. It is admissible as historical proof." Blaine's face contorted with rage. He was not to be denied his prize. "I am still arresting her," he snarled. But as he moved toward Elise again, he found his way blocked. Mrs. Gable, the blacksmith's wife, had stepped in front of him, and then Way, the young cook, and the frantic mother whose child Elise had found in the market. A small but determined group of ordinary townspeople formed a human wall around her. "She stays with us, Mrs., Gable said, her voice firm. "She is a friend," Way added, his small frame radiating a fierce loyalty. "Leave her alone," the young mother said, her voice trembling but resolute. Blaine looked from their determined faces to the unhelpful expressions on his deputies' faces. For the first time, the solid wall of Silas Van Dorn's power had a crack in it. He was defeated, not by a gun, but by a baker's wife, a cook, and a grateful mother. He spat on the ground in disgust and backed away. Suddenly, a new cry went up. Smoke. A thick plume of it was rising from the tall, dry grass a few hundred yards away, where one of Maddox's carelessly discarded cigarettes had likely landed. In the intense heat and the steady breeze, the small plume exploded into a wall of flame. a grass fire that moved with terrifying speed, directly towards a small herd of horses, Silas Van Doorn's prize breeding stock. Chaos erupted. The surveyors scrambled to save their equipment. Blaine and his men sat on their horses, seemingly paralyzed by the sudden turn of events, but Elise and Jack reacted instantly. They spurred their horses, galloping towards the fire, heedless of the danger. They rode into the thick, choking smoke, their voices calling, their movements sure and expert, turning the terrified animals, driving them away from the path of the flames and towards the safety of the creek. It was a desperate, heroic act of horsemanship. They saved every last animal. Emerging from the smoke moments later, their faces black with soot, their eyes red and streaming. The fire burned itself out at the creek's edge, leaving a great black scar on the land. The surveyors, shaken but impressed, packed up their equipment. "Mr." Abernathy approached Elise, wiping his sweaty face with a handkerchief. "I have seen enough. Miss Whitebird," he said, his voice full of a newfound respect. "The historical evidence is compelling, and your claim appears to be made in good faith. My official report will state that your claim is reasonable and that a full court hearing is required to settle the matter of the title." Silas Van Doorn, who had ridden out to observe the proceedings from a distance, heard the pronouncement and gave a cold, thin smile. "So be it," he said to the man beside him. "We will finish this in court." That night, the world was quiet, washed clean by the darkness. The scent of burned grass hung in the air, a sharp, clean smell. Elise and Jack sat by the slow-moving water of the Red Creek, the same creek that was at the heart of the entire dispute. The stars were brilliant in the black sky, scattered like diamond dust. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Elise, her voice soft in the darkness, broke the silence. "Whitebird's eldest daughter," she said, as if tasting the words. That is what he called her. "My mother and my aunt. They were very close. When my mother died, my aunt, Whitebird, helped raise me. In the eyes of our people, I was as much her daughter as my mother's. Patrick O'Hara knew that." She paused, tracing a pattern in the damp earth with her finger. That name. For so long, I did not know what to do with it. It felt like a coat that was too big for me. It carried so much hope, but also so much pain. It made me proud, but it also made me afraid. Jack listened, his gaze fixed on her profile in the starlight. He did not offer easy words of comfort. He did not tell her not to be afraid. He simply waited, giving her the space to own her story. She finally turned to look at him, her dark eyes searching his. "I am not sure who I am supposed to be. Jack, Elise, the woman who sells herbs in the market, or Wiangska, the woman who is trying to claim half the county." Jack reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were calloused and strong, but they trembled slightly in his. He held her hand, his thumb gently stroking the back of it. "Whatever name you choose," he said, his voice a low, steady anchor in the vast, quiet night, "that is the one I will call you." The Ash Ridge County courtroom was not built for the Dakota summer. By 10 in the morning, the air was already thick and heavy, smelling of dust, stale sweat, and the cheap cologne of Silas Van Doorn's lawyer. Every bench was packed. Ranchers stood shoulder to shoulder with shopkeepers, their faces grim and expectant. In the front row, Sister Agnes sat with a rigid posture, her hands folded over a leather satchel. Standing Bear was there too, a figure of immense, quiet dignity that seemed to mock the stuffy formality of the room. Elise Whitebird sat beside Jack Hollis at a small table facing the judge. She wore a simple calico dress, her hair in a single, neat braid. She looked small against the backdrop of the law, but her stillness was a force, a deep pool of calm in a churning river of tension. Banker Hargreave was the first witness called by Van Doorn's lawyer. He scurried to the stand, his eyes darting everywhere but at Elise. He spoke in a low, rehearsed monotone, confirming that the land in question had no legal heir. that Patrick O'Hara's affairs had been settled years ago, and that the promissory note was a document of sentiment, not legal standing. He lied with the practiced ease of a man who had been telling himself the same lies for years. Then Sister Agnes was called. She walked to the stand with a firm, steady step. From her satchel, she produced 2 documents. The first was a handwritten letter from Patrick O'Hara, dated shortly before his death. It spoke of his love for Whitebird and his desire to provide for her people. It was stamped with the official seal of the mission. The second was the copy of the baptismal record, noting the marriage under Lakota custom. Van Dorn's lawyer sneered. "Your Honor, these are church documents. They have no bearing on territorial property law. A quaint custom is not a legal marriage." Before the judge could rule, Standing Bear was called as a witness for Elise. He did not need an interpreter. He spoke in slow, deliberate English, his voice filling the courtroom with a quiet authority. "A marriage is a promise," he said, his eyes on the judge. "It is a promise made before the Creator and before the people. Patrick O'Hara made this promise to my cousin, Whitebird. He lived by this promise. He provided for her. He was her husband. In the eyes of our people, their union was as real as this building. That makes Wiang Ska, her niece whom she raised as a daughter, his family." The lawyer rose again, his voice dripping with condescension. "Your Honor, with all due respect to the native customs, this court is governed by the laws of the United States, and those laws are clear. An Indian cannot hold private title to land in this territory. The entire premise of this claim is illegal." A murmur went through the crowd. The ugly, unvarnished truth of the matter was now laid bare. It was not about a will or a marriage. It was about race. It was then that Jack Hollis stood up. "Your Honor," he said, his voice not loud, but carrying to every corner of the room, "I ask to speak as a witness to the land itself." The judge, a weary man who had seen too much greed and too little justice, looked at Jack with a flicker of interest. "Proceed, Mr. Hollis." Jack did not look at the lawyer or at Van Dorn. He spoke directly to the judge, his words simple, direct, and unadorned. "Your Honor, for the past few weeks, I have walked that land with Miss Whitebird. I have seen the stone markers carved with Patrick O'Hara's initials, the same markers that were smashed by Mr. Van Dorn's employees in front of county surveyors. I have seen the illegal dam Mr. Van Dorn built to divert the water from Red Creek onto his own pasture, and I have seen this." He walked to the judge's bench and laid his worn railroad map upon it. He pointed with a calloused finger. "This is a survey map for the new railroad spur. As you can see, the proposed route, the one Mr. Van Dorn is pushing for, runs directly through the land described in O'Hara's note. It follows the creek, because whoever controls that creek controls where the station is built. This is not about grazing land. Your Honor, it has always been about the railroad." The courtroom was utterly silent. Jack had laid out not a legal argument, but a conspiracy, a clear and logical line of greed. All eyes turned to banker Hargreave. The small man had gone deathly pale. Sweat beaded on his upper lip. He looked at Van Dorn, then at the hard, unyielding face of the judge. He looked at the clock on the wall. It was 10 minutes to 3. He suddenly clutched his chest. "Your Honor, I feel unwell. I need some air." Before the judge could respond, Hargreave half stumbled, half ran from the witness stand and out a side door of the courthouse. Jack knew instantly. The 3 o'clock train. He turned to Elise. "Stay here." He was already moving, pushing his way through the stunned crowd. Elise, however, was right behind him, with Sister Agnes following, her face a mask of grim determination. They burst out into the blinding sunlight just in time to see Hargreave scrambling toward the train station, a heavy leather ledger clutched under his arm. That was it, the real ledger, the one that would contain the true record of O'Hara's trust. As Jack sprinted across the dusty ground, a figure stepped out from between 2 freight cars, blocking his path. It was Cole Maddox, his right arm in a sling, his left hand holding a pistol. "The debt is due. Hollis," Maddox snarled. Jack did not have time for this. He ran straight at him. The fight was a brutal, desperate explosion of violence. It was not a duel. It was a brawl. Jack sidestepped a clumsy swing from Maddox's pistol and drove his shoulder hard into the man's chest, sending them both crashing against the side of a cattle car. Maddox brought his knee up, but Jack twisted, taking the blow on his thigh. He grabbed Maddox's gun hand, slamming it again and again against the rough wood of the train car until the pistol fell to the ground. He drove his fist into Maddox's gut, then once more into his jaw. Maddox crumpled, gasping for air. Jack stood over him, his own pistol now in his hand, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He could end it, right here, end the whole bloody story that had started on the banks of the Rosebud. He looked down at the broken, defeated man at his feet. And then he looked at the train, where Elise was now climbing onto the coupling of a moving freight car. He lowered the gun. "It is over. Cole," he said, his voice heavy with an infinite weariness. "The war is over." He turned and ran for the train. Elise swung herself up onto a flat car and confronted the terrified banker, who was cowering behind a stack of crates. The train was picking up speed, the rhythmic clack of the wheels a frantic heartbeat. "Mr. Hargreave," she shouted over the noise. "That book, did Patrick O'Hara give it to you to serve a dead man's greed, or to serve the living?" The banker stared at her, his face a mess of terror and indecision. Just then, Jack leaped onto the car behind them and began desperately turning the iron handbrake wheel, trying to slow the massive weight of the train. On the station platform, Sister Agnes, seeing the situation, ran to the main station house and yanked on the emergency steam whistle cord. A deafening blast shrieked across the prairie. It was too much for Hargreave. The determined woman before him, the desperate man behind him, the screaming whistle all around him. The weight of his long deceit finally crushed him. With a great shuddering sob, he held out the ledger. "Take it," he cried, his voice breaking. "I have held it for too long." He slumped to the floor of the car. A broken man. Back in the courtroom, the arrival of the ledger caused a sensation. The judge opened it, his face grim. The pages were filled with Hargreave's spidery script. And there it was, in black and white, a detailed record of the trust established by Patrick O'Hara, with a clear, unambiguous directive to transfer title of the main pasture and all associated water rights to Whitebird's eldest daughter upon her 21st birthday. The judge looked up, his gaze sweeping over the silent courtroom before landing on Silas Van Dorn. "This court," he announced, his voice booming with renewed authority, "finds the claim of Miss Elise Whitebird to be valid. I am issuing a temporary injunction, recognizing her as the rightful owner of the disputed property, pending a final, formal registration of the title." It was then that Silas Van Dorn finally broke. The law, the town, everything he thought he owned had turned against him. With a raw, animalistic roar of fury, he pulled a massive revolver from under his coat. Sheriff Blaine, standing nearby, hesitated, his hand hovering over his own weapon, his loyalty finally snapping under the strain. At that same moment, Standing Bear and a half-dozen of the townspeople who had stood with Elise surged forward. Jack, seeing the danger, threw himself in front of Elise, shielding her with his own body. 3 shots exploded in the courtroom, a chaotic, deafening volley. No one seemed to know who had fired. The judge hammered his gavel down with a thunderous crack. "Order," he roared, "order in this court." When the smoke cleared, no one was dead. 1 bullet was lodged in the wall above the judge's head. Another had shattered the window. A third had torn through the sleeve of Van Dorn's coat. Sheriff Blaine stood frozen, his face ashen. The judge pointed a trembling finger at him. "Sheriff, you are stripped of your badge. You are a disgrace to this office." In the confusion, Silas Van Dorn, his face a mask of pure hatred, turned and fled through the same side door Hargreave had used, a fugitive from his own broken empire. The day after the chaos in the courtroom, The sky broke. For the first time in months, a slow, steady rain began to fall. It was not a violent storm, but a gentle, cleansing shower that settled the dust that had plagued the town for so long. It washed the soot from the air and the blood from the street. It was the smell of a new beginning. In the afternoon, under a sky of soft, dove-gray clouds, Elise Whitebird stood on the steps of the courthouse, the temporary injunction. A heavy document full of legal language was placed before her on a small table. The new interim sheriff, a quiet man who had been a deputy in a neighboring county, stood by respectfully. A small crowd had gathered, not a mob this time, but a quiet collection of onlookers, their faces a mixture of curiosity, respect, and lingering uncertainty. Sister Agnes stood beside Elise, a silent, supportive presence. The interim sheriff pointed to the line at the bottom of the page. "You can sign here, Miss." Elise picked up the pen. She did not hesitate. In a clear, strong hand, she wrote not the name the mission had given her, but the one her ancestors had, Wyangska. She set the pen down. The name seemed to pulse on the page, a statement of identity more powerful than any legal decree. Sister Agnes placed a hand on her shoulder, a simple, profound blessing. A new chapter for Ash Ridge had begun, signed into law not with a Christian name, but with the name of a Lakota woman. The old chapter was ending in a swampy marshland 10 miles to the south. A posse, led by the new sheriff, had cornered Silas Van Dorn there. There was no final, glorious gunfight. There was only a desperate, pathetic chase through mud and cattails that ended with a rich and powerful man surrendering, his fine suit ruined, his face a mask of bitter defeat. He was brought back to town in chains, his reign of fear over. That same evening, Jack returned to his small room at the boarding house, sitting on the windowsill. Catching the last of the fading light was a single, empty brass shell casing. It was from Cole Maddox's gun. Jack picked it up. It was still faintly warm. He knew what it meant. Maddox was gone. The debt, real or imagined, was settled. The past was finally, truly over. In the following weeks, Elise did not act like a conqueror. She acted like a caretaker. She rode out, not to survey her vast new holdings, but to visit the small ranches and homesteads that dotted the landscape. She went to the Gables farm, to the small homestead of the young mother from the market, to every family whose life depended on the waters of the Red Creek. She sat in their kitchens and on their front porches, and she listened. She heard their fears of drought, their worries about the future. And then she spoke, not with the language of the law, but with the language of community. "The water does not belong to me," she told each of them. "It belongs to the land, and to all who live on it with respect. Use what you need for your families and your animals. Do not waste it. Do not hoard it. We will share it, as neighbors should. Anyone who uses the water will be like family." She established a simple, fair system of water rights, based not on acreage or wealth, but on need. The tension that had gripped the community began to dissolve. The fear of Van Dorn's fences was replaced by the promise of Elise's open gates. The social fabric of Ash Ridge, so badly torn, began to slowly knit itself back together. Jack did not drift on. He stayed. He spent his days at the site of Elise's ruined cabin, his hammer ringing out in the clear autumn air. He was a fixer, and this was the most important thing he had ever been called upon to fix. He rebuilt the structure, not just as it had been, but better. The walls were sturdier, the roof line truer, and he added something new. A wide porch on the front, with a roof to provide shade, a place to sit and watch the prairie breathe. Elise came by one afternoon with 2 mugs of hot coffee. He was struggling with a stubborn nail, which had bent under a misplaced hammer blow. He pulled it out, frowning at its crooked shape. "This nail," he said with a wry smile, holding it up for her to see, "it reminds me of my life. Bent out of shape, Not good for much. Elise took the nail from him and looked at it. Then she looked at him, her dark eyes soft. It is not useless, Jack. It just needs to be straightened out and hammered into place by a steady hand. She handed him his coffee, their fingers touching for a moment. He took the bent nail and, with a few skillful taps of his hammer, straightened it. He then drove it home, perfectly true, into a fresh pine board that smelled of the forest. A few nights later, the work was finished. The cabin was no longer a ruin, but a home. That evening, in the soft glow of a single lantern, Jack and Elise stood in the main room. There was no furniture yet, only the clean, open space and the scent of new wood. From outside, the soft, reedy notes of a flute drifted through the open door. It was Way, sitting on the steps of the new porch, playing a gentle, haunting melody. Without a word, Jack held out his hand. Elise took it. He placed his other hand on her waist, and they began to dance, their movements slow and a little awkward at first on the rough plank floor. They were not dancers, but they found their rhythm, a simple, swaying motion in time with the sad, sweet music. They did not speak. They did not need to. In the circle of his arms, Elise felt a sense of safety and belonging she had never known. In the warmth of her presence, Jack felt the ghosts of his past finally fade into silence. The music ended. They stood for a moment in the quiet, their faces close in the lantern light. "Stay," Elise whispered, the word a barely audible breath. Jack looked down at her, his heart full. "If you want me to," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I will move in." A week later, the first potluck was held on the grounds of the new cabin. Standing Bear came, and he brought with him a large ceremonial drum. He sat before it, and its deep, steady beat became the heartbeat of the gathering. The people came, Mrs. Gable brought a freshly baked apple pie. Way brought a huge platter of savory dumplings. The Gables and other small ranchers came, their faces open and friendly. And from the Lakota camp, a dozen of Elise's relatives came, their colorful blankets a bright counterpoint to the drab homespun of the townspeople. They laid out their food on long tables Jack had built, a feast of two cultures coming together. There were no speeches, no grand pronouncements. There was only the quiet murmur of conversation, the laughter of children, and the steady, unifying rhythm of the drum. It was a fragile peace, a tentative beginning, but it was real. As the sun began to set, casting long, golden shafts of light across the prairie, Elise stood on her new porch, looking out at the land. The lines of Van Dorn's barbed wire fences were still visible in the distance, but she could see that the gates were now propped open. "This land," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. "It is not a prize to be won, it is a responsibility." Jack came to stand beside her, slipping his arm around her waist. He followed her gaze, then looked down at her, a playful glint in his eyes. "You have half the county in your hands," he teased gently. "And I reckon the other half is, well, the other half is you." A laugh, clear and joyful, escaped her. She turned in his arms, her face tilted up to his, before he could speak another word. She leaned in and kissed him. It was a kiss full of promise, of rain after a long drought, of a home built by steady hands, and of a future as wide and open as the prairie sky. The prairie had a long memory. It remembered the tread of buffalo and the whisper of ancient winds. Now, it was beginning to remember a new story, one of peace born from struggle. The seasons turned, and the raw, angry scar of the grass fire healed, replaced by the tender green shoots of new life. Ash Ridge was changing. Too, the changes were not loud or sudden. Like a gunshot in a crowded room, they were quiet and steady, like the first rains of the season soaking into the thirsty earth. The new sheriff, a man named Elias Thorne, was a quiet man who believed the law was a shield, not a club. He wore his badge with a sober sense of duty, and the town, accustomed to Blaine's bluster, responded with a grudging but growing respect. The railroad developers, deprived of their ally in Silas Van Dorn, came to the table not with threats, but with proposals. They met with Elise and a council of the local ranchers, and together, they hammered out an agreement for the new rail spur. The station would be built, but the water of the Red Creek would be shared, its use governed by the simple, fair rules Elise had laid out. Technology, once a tool of conquest, was becoming a tool of cooperation, its path guided by a new conscience. And in town, the small eatery where Way worked was now the busiest establishment on Main Street. People came not just for the good food, but for the quiet, decent young man who cooked it, a man who had stood with his friends when it mattered. The invisible walls that had divided the community were beginning to crumble. One shared meal, one neighborly conversation at a time. The greatest change, however, had taken place within two people who had once been drifters on the sea of their own pasts. Young Ska was no longer a woman living on the fringes, a seller of herbs and remedies. She had become the heart of the valley, a guardian of its lifeblood, a bridge between two peoples who had forgotten how to speak to one another. She had faced the law, not with a weapon, but with its own best principles, and had learned that justice, though often blind, could sometimes be made to see. She had not conquered the land. She had answered its call, accepting the responsibility that came with its ownership. And Jack Hollis, the man who was always just passing through, had finally stopped. He had found something worth staying for. The ghosts of the Little Bighorn still visited him some nights, but their voices were fainter now, drowned out by the sound of his hammer striking true, of shared laughter in the evenings, of the steady, peaceful rhythm of a life being built, not just fixed. He had been a man running from a past he could not change. Now, he was a man building a future he could choose. He was learning that a home was not a place you found, but a place you made. Inside their small, sturdy cabin, the symbols of their separate journeys came together on the wall above the stone hearth. Jack carefully hung his old, worn railroad map, its faded lines telling a story of wrong turns and a final, right destination, beside it. Elise placed the singed eagle feather, its resilience a testament to the spirit that could not be burned. It was a strange pairing, the surveyor's grid and the gift of the sky, and beneath them, in a simple wooden frame Jack had made, they hung the water agreement. It was a document written in plain English, but its principles were born of the Lakota belief that the land and the people were one. It was their own declaration of independence, a new law for a new kind of West. One crisp autumn afternoon, as the leaves of the cottonwood trees along the creek were turning to gold, Sister Agnes arrived in her buckboard. She carried not a warning this time, but a gift. It was a letter, the envelope yellowed and brittle with age, the postmarks faded and strange. This came to the mission years ago, the nun explained, her eyes soft. It was sent from Ireland. I did not know what to do with it then, but I think it has finally found its proper home. That evening, by the light of a single lantern, Elise carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in a spidery, elegant script. She read it aloud, her voice soft in the quiet room, while Jack listened, his hand resting on her shoulder. It was from Patrick O'Hara's sister. It spoke of her love for her adventurous brother, her sorrow at his passing in a land so far from home. And then it spoke of his letters, of the joy and peace he had found with his Lakota wife, Whitebird. We did not understand his choice at first, the letter read, but his words taught us that the heart has its own country, and love has its own laws. We trust our Patrick's heart. We believe he chose well. We pray for the happiness of his wife, and for any children she might raise in that wild, beautiful land. Please know that across the great ocean, you have family who think of you. Elise finished reading, and a single tear traced a path down her cheek. It was not a tear of sorrow, but of release. The final circle had been closed. A bond of love and trust, stretched across an ocean and across the years, had finally been honored. The legacy of Patrick O'Hara was not just the land, but the acceptance and the kindness of a family she had never known. Justice, Jack thought, was not always a thunderclap. Sometimes it was a quiet word, spoken with a love that took a lifetime to arrive. The dawn broke, as it always did, in a silent, breathtaking explosion of color over the Black Hills. The eastern sky bloomed from a soft rose to a brilliant gold. Chasing the last of the purple shadows from the plains, a herd of wild horses, their coats shining in the new light, galloped across the horizon, their manes and tails flowing like banners of freedom. It was a sight of such raw, untamed beauty that it made the heart ache. Ska stood on the porch that Jack had built, a warm mug of coffee in her hands, watching the day be born. She was not watching as an owner, but as a part of the landscape itself, as connected to the rising sun and the running horses as the grass beneath her feet. The West was not a place to be won, but a place to belong. And true freedom, she now knew, was not the absence of fences, but the ability to choose where you put down your roots, and the courage to take responsibility for the garden you grew there. The cabin door opened, and Jack stepped out onto the porch. He came to stand beside her, his presence a familiar, comforting warmth. He looked out at the vast, sun-drenched prairie, and then he looked at her, his eyes full of a quiet, steady love. A small, familiar smile touched his lips. "Can I walk you home, miss?" he asked, his voice a low, gentle rumble. Ska smiled, a slow, beautiful smile that held the light of the morning sun. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her gaze fixed on the endless horizon. "This is home," she said softly. "But with you, Jack, every road is home. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the heart of the American West. We invite you to share where you are listening from in the comments below so we can all connect. And please remember to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Tales. Like this video, and show your support by hitting the hype button to help this story reach more listeners.